Welcome to Compose Yourself, the podcast where academic writing meets self-discovery for the students at the Chicago School.
I'm Jason.
And I'm Cindy.
Whether you're crafting your first essay or refining your voice as a writer, we're here to guide you through the art of composition.
From brainstorming to final drafts, we'll break down the tools and techniques to help you think critically, write effectively, and express yourself with confidence.
So, grab a pen, open your mind, and
compose yourself. Welcome to Module 1. In today's episode, we're going to be discussing what it means to have a strong writing voice. And we're also going to talk about the Cisneros reading titled Only Daughter that you'll read in this module. And then we're going to just discuss some thoughts about writing from a guy called Peter Elbow. So we're going to get started by talking about writer's voice. So writer's voice can be really hard to define, and sometimes people think it's not that important in academic writing because you're going to do mostly APA style writing, which maybe is less flowery and less expressive or artistic, let's say, than maybe other forms of writing. But I do still think it's really important to have a writer's voice, even in academic spaces. So, Jason, what do you think about when you hear that something has a strong writer's voice?
this one's hard because, like you said, it really is difficult to define what voice is. Um, but it's also one of those things that you do know it when you see it or when you hear it. Kind of like how if a friend calls you up on the phone, you don't even need to see who's calling you. You know who it is. And writing is definitely the same way. You can tell the more and more you write, you may not be able to identify that author per se, but you can tell from their word choice, from their tone, from the length of their sentences, their word order, their punctuation, what their voice is and what the identity of that writer is.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think it's why we enjoy reading different writing from different people. And believe me, instructors want to read different writing from different people. They don't want to read a
Oh, yes.
paper that every student sounds exactly the same and they used exactly the same thesis statement and, almost like it's a formula or it's standardized. As an instructor, I think that's very boring. I would love to just read your imperfect writing rather than read some formulaic, perfect thesis. I
Right.
prefer that
Right.
imperfect voice that comes through. And I think voice is interesting because it really does capture your own thoughts and your authenticity. And you take that across different writing situations. So even though I might be writing different ways, like the way I might write a text to a friend, or I might write a letter, or I might write an academic paper, I'm still going to be the same writer in all those situations. And you ought to sort of be able to tell even though I
Right.
have to take on sort of different identities as I mediate those different ways of communicating with different kinds of people. And I think this is really important, especially today as we are encountering all of these generative AI tools that students
Oh
can
gosh.
use that sort of help to sort of quote help them with their writing. What do you think is most challenging about these tools and how students are engaging with them to sort of help them sound what I hear students say is smarter?
For a long time, I taught in the K-12 environment. And it reminds me of when, people would joke for the kind of the sophisticated British accent. Everybody knew it was a joke. They would start being fake and just say, like, well, indubitably, I do declare that this is blah, blah, blah. And the reason it's a joke is because they knew it wasn't authentic.
Right.
They were using words like indubitably and they couldn't spell it. They didn't know what that word meant. So they were performing. And that's really not what we're looking for. And even furthermore, it's not what your audience is looking for. It's not what the reader is looking for. If we can tell, your audience can tell. They know you're being inauthentic. I mean,
I
what
love that. I
what do you
love that
notice?
idea
Or
of like I love your idea of performing. That's such a good way of describing it because that's absolutely what we don't want our students to do, right? We want them to be
right.
authentic, right? As you to what whoever your reader is at that for that writing situation. Um, to try to like sound smarter sometimes. I mean, I get why students feel like they should do that, but we really just want them to write as themselves and develop a writing voice that's
Right.
possibly more sophisticated as they go through their academic program. But there's no pressure to sound somehow more sophisticated right now as you're taking your first course in this program,
Right.
right?
It's like asking a kindergartner to come into 12th grade and pass the SAT. I mean, they're not going to do it because they're not at that stage yet. So you have to, part of that authenticity is accepting who you are and kind of celebrating your voice and realizing, I don't have to pretend that I have a PhD in psychology right now. Right? I'm
Yes.
just getting started. So be okay with that. You know what? That's okay.
Yes. I think one really good way, since voice is like so hard to sort of get your hands around and pin it down to a certain definition, one way to really identify voice is to read something that has really great writer's voice. And I think that's why we
Always.
wanted to bring in Only Daughter by Sandra Cisneros, because it's so full of writing voice. You really
Yep.
hear this writer as a person through this piece. It's a great example of things like code switching and changing your use of language as you sort of mediate your different identities, as the writer does in this particular piece. She writes both in English and in Spanish in this piece, and it's very powerful the way that she integrates those in because it's part of the way that she shows us her experience and who she is and her identity versus telling us who
Right.
she is. So is there something in the Cisneros reading that you think is really demonstrative of her voice in her writing, or something that you really want to point out?
Um, I mean, I think you mentioned it. I grew up, I was born in Texas. And there's something, we called Spanglish, but that is this intermixing where maybe you're speaking mostly English and then you drop a phrase or you drop maybe a short sentence, or even just a word in. And that kind of intermingling reflects the experience that I had growing up, the people I was around. And Cisneros does this in this piece. So for example, there's this thing where she says, I wanted my father to understand what it was I was scribbling, to introduce me as my only daughter, the writer, not as, this is my only daughter, she teaches, es maestra, teacher, not even profesora. And so, I can see from that, even if I didn't know Spanish, which I'm not fluent in, I could see as the audience that she's making a distinction with these terms and connecting them back to the same environment she had as a child growing up, with a bilingual family. Um, all of that comes through in just that short little section.
I completely agree. I think the use of the intermingling there of the two languages that she mediates her identity through are really important. We may not all have that. We may not be
Right.
bilingual, and but we all have different ways of communicating with different groups of people, right? The way I talk to my family might be different than the way that I talk to, say, my peers in the classroom or
Right. Right.
to my boss at work or whatever. So we're all always mediating our identities across groups using our language. Um, I think one thing that she does really well too is that sort of art of helping us understand her and her father through
Right.
showing us in her writing. So, as we're going to be working on narratives in this class, one thing we really want them to get into doing is showing us through their writing what do we need to know about you? What do we need to know about the other people? And there's a passage where she's talking about her father, sort of he's had a stroke and he's laying upstairs and watching his favorite TV show and eating a certain thing. And she really describes like there's a balled up Kleenex and there are pills everywhere. And there's a urinal that she doesn't want to look at, but she can't look away. And um, you get this image, you can picture what's going on, that she's coming in here to talk to her father and to show him this thing that she's written. And she really sets the scene. So I
Right.
think one
Right.
thing that really aids in this writer's voice is not just how we switch the way we communicate to demonstrate these different identities that we mediate, it's also how we show a reader what's going on. So she didn't have to tell us My father had a stroke. He's on a lot of medication. He's feeling unwell. He watches a lot of TV. That's one way to tell a story, but
Right.
she doesn't
Right.
do that. She shows us the scene that she's walking into. And I think that's really another way that writer's voice comes through really well. What do you think?
Well, I was actually just wondering what impact do you think that has upon you as a reader? Like that distinction between show don't tell. We've talked about that impact of voice and that kind of idea of authenticity. So yeah, like when you read that scene, how did it make you feel, or what did you do? What happened in your mind with that show versus tell distinction?
I think it invites the reader to be the person who's walking in the room. It's not
Oh,
just let me tell you the room I walked into and what's going on in there. Is she in when you describe a scene this way, you're inviting your reader to be you, to see what you're seeing, to experience it
right.
instead of just sort of a third party kind of observing her walk in the room or having her tell you what happened. I feel like it invites the reader more into the scene than just to observe it as a third party.
I had a student once who told me that it's kind of like picking up an instruction manual for, let's say, a couch. And you could just read the instruction manual, and sure, you get what's going on, you know how to put it together, or you take a video of the couch. And the distinction is that, which one, at the end of the day, which couch would you buy? If you're
Hmm.
just given the instruction manual, or if you get to see a video of it and see what it really looks like. And that's kind of, in my mind, I loved the way that they described that because
Hmm.
yeah, like you said, it really puts the reader, the audience, in the driver's seat and connects them to the that narrative or any kind of, piece of writing.
Yeah, I think when we're talking about writer's voice, there's one person who always comes to my mind, and that's Peter Elbow. So Peter Elbow was a teacher and a writer who spent a lot of time writing about and thinking about writer's voice and how to really bring that into your writing as a student. And he has such interesting ways of communicating about voice. He says, in one example, he says, every person's chest cavity, like the size of their rib cage, their lung capacity, their vocal cords, everybody's are formed slightly differently so that the sound of my voice is not the same as the sound of someone else's. There are always going to be some differences
Right.
there because we're totally unique in that way. Structurally, we're unique and our voice is unique. And that's true of the way that we use our voice in writing. So, the way that I'm going to pull my thoughts together, the way that I'm going to structure a sentence, the way that I would describe the same thing that you're seeing, I would describe it my way and you would describe it slightly differently. You would use different sentence
Right.
structure, different word choice. And I think that's really important. There isn't a right way to describe something. So, when we talked earlier about having the perfect thesis, even if you tell two writers to write about the same topic, they can have two valid thesis statements that are very different and they should be different because they're different writers. What do you think about Elbow's conception of like this unique, not only just physical voice, but our writing voice, how those are different?
I think it reminds us that we're human, right? And that's really what we're navigating in all forms of writing. This isn't mathematics. This isn't a physics equation that kind of exists out in the world. These are our observations, these are our thoughts, and it's also like the relationship we have with a topic, with an idea, with opinions, or and even more of kind of like the social sciences. There's the sum total of my experiences will mean that if I want to be, a clinician or a therapist or something, I'm going to have a different perspective or a different approach, just like you said. So I like the way that Elbow framed that, um, because it reminds us that there has to be a connection between the human and what we create. We
Yes.
can't separate those two things.
Yes. And humans are not machines.
Right.
Unlike AI, we don't just crank out a grammatically perfect sentence every time. None of us do. All writers have more to learn, right?
Right.
You and
Right.
I have been writing for lots of years collectively, and we still have to edit our writing. We still forget how to spell
Constantly.
things. We still
Constantly.
miss punctuation. But that's sort of the beauty of, we're not saying, I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't edit our work. I'm suggesting that, like Elbow suggests, giving yourself the space to write freely. So one of the things Elbow really
Right. Right.
pushes when it comes to practicing your voice and figuring out what you sound like on the page is to free write. And that just means like letting yourself write without an editor. So let's say a student's working on a short paper, or a discussion board post or something like that. To free write in that would just mean don't turn on any tools. Shut off the Grammarly. Shut
Yep.
off the editor function. Don't let Google Docs be telling you what's wrong with it while you're doing it. You write your post, you get your thoughts on the page, you let yourself just write it. And then maybe you go back and you turn on the Grammarly and you turn on the editor function in Microsoft Word or whatever the tool is that you're using to help you sort of fix your punctuation and your grammar or your spelling. Turn those things on, fix those things up if you need to, but don't have the critic on the page while you're trying to practice just writing in your own voice. What do you think about that advice?
I mean, I always think, especially that last part, see, that's my biggest problem. And it's probably because I was raised a little bit before a lot of these tools became available. And they're great. They're great. But I always have that internal critic. So it's almost like my struggle when I first started learning how to free write was that I would write out a sentence, pause, and then I would go back and reread the sentence. And then I would notice something and say, oh, I don't like how this says or sounds or blah, blah, blah. And before I know it, I've spent 5 minutes on, one or two sentences. That's the same exact thing as these spell checks or as
Mm,
Grammarly, because it's that internal critic, it's that internal censor, who is not allowing your authenticity, your voice, but also just your brain to kind of get everything out.
hmm
So that really is the hardest part. You kind of, it's almost like I wish I could just blindfold myself. And I have known students who did something similar, not really blindfold themselves, but they would take like the speech recording on their phone
Oh,
and
yes,
they would
so
just talk.
smart.
They
Yeah.
would just ramble and ramble and ramble. And it's going to be a mess. It is an absolute mess. But they find the gems there, or they
hmm
solve something there, or they see like the beginnings
hmm
of what they're going to create later on.
That's such a great idea.
Um,
I see a lot of students do free writing in that you set a timer. Set a timer for 10
yeah,
minutes. Don't
yeah.
pick your pen up or don't stop typing. Don't edit yourself. Don't decide if this sentence looks right after this one. Don't decide if you have a thesis. Don't start at the introduction if that doesn't work for you. Just
Oh,
write your ideas for 10 minutes and then stop, walk away for a little while, and then come back and
right.
you'll see I have ideas. I have stuff I want to say about this topic. I feel like that's always the best way to get sort of things going so that you can really write something that you feel really proud of in the end. You can't do
Right.
that unless you give yourself permission to just write freely to start. So
So
I
our,
think
our
it's im
brains are smarter than we are, which is kind of a
yes.
paradoxical statement, but it's kind of like that. It's really popular on the internet is shower thoughts. And I've seen it like on Reddit and on X and stuff like that. But the idea being that you will be mulling over something when you
Oh.
want to solve it and you can't solve it. And then suddenly later in the day, wake up from a nap or you're taking a shower and you have that aha moment.
Mm.
That's what free writing, in my opinion, allows. It allows you to get it all out. And then when you take that step back, like you said, you'll get that aha moment. It's in there. You may not know it, but it is in what you wrote.
Yes. I think it's sort of like priming the machine, like your brain wants to solve
Right.
your problems. So free writing gives your brain this sort of fodder to go forth and what do I need to say? What do I need to write? And it tells your brain what you're working on. I
Right.
think free writing is helpful for any writing assignment. So just giving yourself some space to think on paper. And I think people can skip free writing because it feels a little bit like journaling or maybe it doesn't feel like it's scholarly enough. But I think it's important to remember that all writing will make you a better writer. If you're a
Right.
daily journaler, if you write a blog, if you regularly write engaging posts for social media, however you're practicing, you're still practicing your voice and you're practicing getting comfortable as a writer. And academic writing is just a new way of expressing yourself as you become part of this new community that you're in. So I think one of the most important things for us about this particular podcast is to help students sort of develop themselves as members of this new academic community. They're
Right.
scholars. They're
Right.
starting to do academic writing in a college space, which is likely new for them. So I think it's important to remember that even the writing that we do that we think isn't scholarly or it's not academic enough still helps us develop confidence as writers who can then move into that academic space and begin to see ourselves as academic writers. What are your thoughts about academic writing and identity and how they sort of come together in that space?
Rome wasn't built in a day. I mean, really, that kind of like what we've talked about all throughout this whole episode is just that, just like your identity is not something that you kind of hit and it's done. Um, so too, like you said, with your writing. Writing is a process. It's not that end product. And so, yeah, academic writing can be intense. It can seem intimidating. But you're not going to be expected to do a master's level or a PhD level dissertation or thesis at this stage. You have to start somewhere. And so if you're not willing to just kind of let go, to listen to your voice, to connect with material, and to practice, 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 I don't know if you will prohibit yourself from getting there. So you have to take that vulnerable stance in order to finally achieve and enter into an academic space. What do you think?
I think that's true. I hope what we've accomplished here in this first episode is really to just help students understand that you have to be ready to try, right? You're not
Right.
going to get it perfect. We don't expect perfection. This class is to help sort of prime you for academic writing that you're going to do in all of your courses, right? So I think we want to give them the freedom to try, to
Yeah,
take the
that's
risk
it.
that you're going to write an assignment and it's not going to be perfect because perfection is not required in this class. But
Nobody's perfect. Yeah.
effort and practice and development is. And I think that all writing gives us a chance to develop. So I really hope that as we talk about writing voice and we practice our writing voice through the different kinds of writing that we're going to do in this class, and we read what it looks like to have a beautiful writer's voice in the Cisneros reading, that our students really start to think about, okay, I can do this. I'm a writer. I write things all the time. I just have to practice writing in this new academic space as a scholar. So I hope
Exactly.
that comes through as we're working through this first podcast for them.
I think it will, kind of reminds me of Aladdin, looking down at Jasmine and he says, "Do you trust me?" And that's the first thing I usually post up in front of my class. And they all kind of laugh and they stare at me and they think I'm a little weird and campy, which I am. And then by the end of the semester, I pull it back up and I say, have you improved?
Yeah,
Every
right,
single one of them, they're like, you know what? You were right. You were right. I should have trusted you. So just do it. Just write.
right. That is the goal of composition. Just write and watch yourself improve.
There you go.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of Compose Yourself.
Remember, writing is a process, and every word you write brings you closer to becoming the writer you want to be.
We hope you enjoyed today's discussion and that it makes clearer the topics you're exploring in this course. If you have any questions or comments, please reach out to your instructor.
Until next time, keep thinking critically
And always compose yourself.